Slavery was not a uniquely American evil, nor was it entirely race-based. I'm Peter Serafine, founder of Liberty Lighthouse. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. Oh, great, an old white guy about to lecture us on slavery. But hear me out. What you'll find isn't a guilt trip, an apology, or some politically charged narrative. This is about facts, straightforward historical facts that often get lost or distorted in modern retellings. Stick with me, and you might be surprised to learn how much of what you've been taught about slavery is oversimplified or just plain wrong. Slavery has existed throughout the world for all of human history. Nearly every ancient civilization relied on enslaved labor to build their empires. The Egyptians used slaves to construct their monuments. The Greeks and the Romans enslaved prisoners of war, using them from everything from agriculture to household work. In Asia, slavery took many forms, including debt bondage and the caste system, with millions forced into labor. Even African kingdoms, like the Ashanti and Dahomey, captured and sold people long before Europeans began to colonize the New World. And the Islamic slave trade spanned over 1,000 years, enslaving millions across Africa, Europe, and Asia. So no, slavery wasn't invented by America. It was humanity's shame long before the first African slaves arrived here in 1619. But now let's focus on North America. Before European settlers arrived, Native American tribes practiced slavery. They enslaved captives from other rival tribes, forcing them into labor and harsh conditions. This wasn't just a fringe practice. It was embedded in the cultures of many tribes. And when Europeans began to colonize the New World, the first slaves they brought weren't African. They were white. Poor Europeans, criminals, and debtors were shipped here as indentured servants. These people worked in brutal conditions, often side by side with the later arriving African slaves, under systems that did not initially discriminate by race. Race-based slavery, as we know it today, began in part because African tribes participated in the transatlantic slave trade. These tribes captured and sold other Africans to European traders in exchange for goods and weapons. It was a business, a very lucrative one, and they were willing participants. This complicates the narrative that slavery was purely a white-on-black atrocity. And speaking of complicating the narrative, did you know that the first documented legal case about slavery in the American colonies wasn't white on black? In 1655, Anthony Johnson, a free black man, sued in colonial court to keep John Casser, another black man, as his slave for life. Johnson won, setting the legal precedent for lifelong servitude. That doesn't quite fit the narrative that we've been taught now, does it? The United States declared independence in 1776 and allowed slavery until 1865, a span of just 89 years. Compared to the existence of slavery throughout humanity, this was a relatively short period of time. Individual states began outlawing slavery as early as 1777, demonstrating that the movement toward abolition was already underway during the nation's founding. Unlike most countries, however, the United States abolished slavery nationwide through a bloody civil war. Over 600,000 Americans sacrificed their lives to end the disgusting and unjust institution, making the United States one of the few, if not the only, nations to abolish slavery through war. That's a legacy worth remembering. But the complexities of slavery in America didn't end there. Even after abolition, some Native American tribes resisted freeing their slaves. The Cherokee Nation, for example, kept slaves well into the Reconstruction period and only released enslaved African Americans after being forced by federal authority. This highlights that slavery in America wasn't exclusively a white issue. It was an institution that crossed cultural and racial lines. And while the U.S. ended slavery in 1865, it continued in other parts of the world. Brazil didn't abolish slavery until 1888, 23 years later. Saudi Arabia officially abolished slavery in 1962. And Mauritania, well, they didn't make slavery illegal until 1981. And even then, it still persisted in illegal forms. That's not ancient history. It's within many of our lifetimes. I remember hearing the news that slavery had finally been abolished in the last nation in 1981, and I was shocked that slavery was still legal anywhere. Slavery was a global evil that affected every civilization in history. The United States was part of that history, but it also made monumental sacrifices to abolish it. Understanding this broader context doesn't excuse slavery, it puts it in perspective. And that perspective matters if we're going to move forward as a united people. Narratives like the 1619 Project would have you believe that slavery is the defining feature of American history, as if it started and ended here. But history isn't that simple. Oversimplifying slavery as uniquely American or entirely race-based not only ignores the global and historical context, but it also fuels division. Worse, it distracts from the incredible sacrifices made to abolish slavery in the United States. So rather than race baiting with papers like the 1619 Project, or stroking division with talk about reparations, how about we celebrate the fact that the United States was one of the first nations to abolish slavery? And let's take time to honor and remember the over 600,000 Americans who gave their lives to make that happen. That's a legacy worth preserving, and a history that should unite us, not tear us apart.